During the presidential campaign, the man who is now president famously said that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and he could get away with it. Today, his lawyers made that argument formally in court.
You can invent scenarios where you can imagine that it would be necessary, or at least perhaps a good idea, for a sitting president to be subject to a criminal charge, even by a state, while in office. If he, for example, did pull out a handgun and shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, well, I mean, what would be the impact of that? Would local police be disabled from restraining such a person, or from processing such a person? Would we have to wait for an impeachment proceeding to be initiated?
What's your view on the Fifth Avenue example? Local authorities couldn't investigate, they couldn't do anything about it?
I think once a president is removed from office, any local authority, this is not a permanent immunity.
Well, I'm talking about while in office.
No.
That's the hypo. Nothing could be done. That's your position.
That is correct. That is correct.
That's the hypothetical. Nothing could be done? Local authorities couldn't? No, that's correct, Your Honor, that's correct. President's lawyer claiming in a federal appeals court today that if the president started gunning people down, not only could he not be charged, he couldn't be stopped. Joining us now is Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, former senior official at the Justice Department and the FBI. Chuck, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
My pleasure, Rachel.
So, to a non-lawyer listening today to this argument live, this, to me, sounds like a horror movie. This is the sort of thing that non-lawyers would make up as an argument to make a hyperbolic, over-the-top, absurd argument. To a lawyer, especially a lawyer experienced in federal practice, is this less bad than it seems on the surface?
It's pretty bad, Rachel. You know, I think what happened was that Mr. Trump's lawyer painted himself into a rhetorical corner, right? He wants to argue that a president is immune from investigation. You can't even investigate. And so he almost has to say that there is no circumstance, including shooting someone on Fifth Avenue, under which a president could be prosecuted. If you concede he can be prosecuted, if you concede that he could be charged, you essentially have to concede that he could be investigated. And that was the rhetorical problem. That was the strategic problem that Mr. Trump's lawyer had today. I don't mean that as an excuse for him. I think it's a ridiculous argument, but I think that's where he found himself.
I mean, and haven't we all just learned through the Mueller proceedings and all of the legalese that we all had to wade through in terms of the Mueller report and the arguments about why the president was not described as having potentially committed a criminal offense? I mean, wasn't the whole idea there that Mueller and his team accepted the premise from the Justice Department that the president could not be indicted, but that did not preclude them from investigating the president, which they did quite robustly?
In fact, Mueller says in his report that we are free to investigate a president. In fact, you know where that comes from? It's pretty interesting. We keep talking about these OLC, Office of Legal Counsel, memos out of the Justice Department. One issued under President Nixon, one issued under President Clinton. The one issued under President Clinton in 2000 actually contains a footnote. I'm going to nerd out on you. Footnote 36, Rachel, which specifically says you can investigate a sitting president, not just by a federal grand jury, but also by Congress. And so the Department of Justice has conceded the point. Mr. Trump's lawyer has not.
That, even though you're talking about a footnote there, you're making a very clear point. I was struck also listening to the hearing today that the judges and the attorneys seem to all agree that this is going to end up at the Supreme Court. If the point of law here is that simple, that the Justice Department says a president can be investigated, even if Justice Department policy says he can't be criminally charged, and now the president's lawyers are saying, no, he can't be investigated either, that doesn't sound to me like such a hard point of law that I would assume that it would end up at the Supreme Court.
It may well. You know, one thing we have to watch for is how the Second Circuit writes its opinion. So if they write a very narrow opinion and simply say, this is a subpoena to a third party, the president's accounting firm, not even to the president, and we are going to uphold that, it might be something the Supreme Court isn't all that interested in. And so the Second Circuit's opinion becomes the final word, and its ruling governs the parties. If they write more broadly and they talk about presidential immunity, both from investigation and from prosecution, maybe the Supreme Court is interested and they take the case and it issues the final word. So I don't know that will necessarily end up in the Supreme Court. I imagine the Supreme Court will have an opportunity to decide whether or not it wants to weigh in on the case.
Chuck, let me ask you about one last thing. This argument's happening at the federal courthouse in New York today about the president potentially being prosecuted, this crazy argument about him committing murder and the police being enjoined from stopping him. At the same courthouse today, an hour later, two associates of the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, were both arraigned in a felony campaign finance case that does seem to be linked to the impeachment scandal. These are my friends Lev and Igor. CNN is reporting tonight that Rudy Giuliani himself is now looking for his own defense lawyer, potentially in conjunction with this case. Do you think that is a wise move for Mr. Giuliani?
Absolutely. Look, Rachel, even witnesses in federal criminal investigations, people who have no criminal exposure, it's often wise for them to get an attorney. And probably, very likely, Mr. Giuliani is not merely a witness. He's at least the subject of the investigation, if not a target. One very interesting thing to look for, any good lawyer, any good white-collar criminal defense lawyer will tell her client not to talk. And so, one, it'll be a measure of how effective this attorney is. And two, if Mr. Giuliani really follows that advice, if he really doesn't talk anymore, it'll be a gift to us all.
It will also strain the bounds of physics at this point. Chuck Rosenberg, former senior official at the Justice Department, the current host of an awesome MSNBC podcast called The Oath, where this week Chuck talks to the former commissioner of the Mounties, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Chuck, congratulations on the success of The Oath. Thanks for being here tonight. Great to see you.
My pleasure, Rachel.
All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us.